Chapter 3. The next morning, when Chippewa was in the middle of preparing breakfast, he heard Gustavo tiptoe behind him. He smiled to himself and turned around.
"No need to tiptoe behind me, Gustavo. There's no cheese soufflé in the oven."
He laughed as he put 2 plates on the table.
"Have a seat. Is Dan awake?"
"Not yet, Chippewa. And I wanted to speak to you before he comes down anyway." Chippewa lifted his gaze to the big man.
"What's the matter? You got second thoughts about accompanying Dan on his journey now?"
Gustavo sat down and poured himself some coffee from the coffee pot on the table. "No, that's not it. I haven't changed my mind at all, but I'm worried about him. He's already knocked on Evil's door once, and we almost lost him that time. Now he's turning people who could help him find his son away. I don't think that's a good idea." Chippewa sat down beside Gustavo after he had put some eggs and bacon on his plate.
"I wouldn't worry too much about that, Gustavo. Dan knows that he will need help in this journey and in finding Daniel, but as you know by now, Dan is a self-made young man. He had to fend for himself since he was very young. He doesn't like to count on anyone for fear that they would cut him loose too early."
"Yeah, I know, and that's sad, really. He's had a hard time of it, but now I think he should accept a helping hand. It's not like he could accomplish anything like that on his own, now could he?"
"Oh, you'd be surprised what Dan could do on his own if he put his mind to it."
Chippewa watched Gustavo as he started eating.
"But I think in this instance he will need guidance and someone to prevent him from jumping off the cliff."
"Yeah, I heard you say that before. But Dan's very stubborn, and if he's decided one day to jump off that cliff, as you said, I don't think I could stop him. No one could, actually."
"Well, you've got Solange and Damien looking after him anyway,"
Chippewa replied.
"And our job is to bring him back to 2013 safely."
Gustavo shook his head and swallowed a bite of toast. "But isn't that only one part of the job? Don't we have to help him find his son too, or first, I should say?"
"I'd been thinking about that last night, actually,"
Chippewa said, rising from his seat and going back to the stove. He turned around, crossed his arms over his chest and added,
"This may sound a little bizarre to you, but I have an idea that Daniel will be the one finding his father, not the other way around."
Gustavo drank some more of his coffee. "You mean Daniel is going to look for his dad too?" He shook his head. "Well, I guess that makes sense, but will he ask for Damianos' assistance, you think?"
"No, Gustavo, I don't think he could. You see, when he went for that swim, he cut all ties with Damianos. That cat, although very clever, couldn't communicate with Daniel right now."
"But wasn't that the same with Dan? I mean, when he fell in the clearing, he couldn't communicate with Damianos, but then someone sent Nicholas to the rescue, sort of thing. Couldn't God do the same with Daniel and send someone to tell him how he could get back on track, kind of thing?"
"Perhaps yes, but at this point, I wouldn't count too much on a messenger coming to Daniel's assistance."
"Why not?" Gustavo asked, getting up to bring his empty plate to the sink.
"Well, because in Dan's case he screamed for help, for one thing, and he opened his mind to every possibility for another."
"But wouldn't Daniel do the same thing?"
"I don't know, Gustavo. To my way of thinking, Daniel was really lost and is trying to comprehend what happened to him and to his family. He's not yet reached a stage where he could plan anything to find his dad. It's too early."
"You mean he's got to recover from the shock first?"
"Exactly. He will need to recognize the date and place at which he's landed first, and then move on from there."
Chippewa had been right. Daniel was still recovering from the shock of being somewhere else than where he should have been. When he came down with Mike to have dinner, he was dressed in his friend's jeans and t-shirt with socks on his feet.
"Ah, there you are,"
Leah said as the 2 young men came down the stairs.
"Are you feeling a little better?"
she asked Daniel. He smiled and replied, "Yes, ma'am. Much better, thank you. I hope you don't mind, but I took a shower. I smelled like the last catch, and I didn't want to come to the table smelling like that."
"And if you hadn't, I would have sent you back upstairs to have a shower anyway,"
Leah replied.
"How's the shoulder? Did you wash it too?"
"Yes, ma'am," Daniel said, lifting the short sleeve of his t-shirt. "I just put some Kleenex over the gash, that's all."
"Okay, we'll get you a proper dressing over that wound after dinner."
Leah turned back to the stove.
"Have a seat at the table. Oswaldo has gone to have a shower. He'll be right down. Are you too hungry?"
"Famished," Mike replied, sitting down beside Daniel and pouring some juice in his glass. "It smells good. Is that spaghetti, Mum?"
"Sure is, and I'm glad that I've made enough to feed an army. Otherwise we would have to share. How about you give a toss to that salad, Mike?"
Leah said, not turning away from whatever she was doing at the kitchen sink. "Okay," Mike replied, standing up again and starting to toss the salad in front of him. Daniel smiled. This was his job when he was at home. He looked down to his lap. He was truly someplace else in time, he thought. He couldn't believe that a half-an-hour swim had separated him from his family, but it had, and he had to come to terms with it. "What's the matter?" Mike asked, sitting down again. "I don't know, but I feel like I'm not supposed to be here. Sorry, I don't mean I don't appreciate being here, but I wish I was sitting with my mum at the kitchen table right now. Depositing a huge bowl of spaghetti on the table, Leah said, After we've had dinner, you'll have to tell us what really happened out there. It's unbelievable that your parents would have left you out there on the pier on your own. I know, Mrs. Gomez, but I think they've gone looking for me, and they're probably thinking I've drowned or something. But wouldn't they have come back to the marina and find out from the manager if he'd seen you come back? Daniel shook his head. I don't know why they didn't come back. I really don't know what happened to them or the boat. When Dan finally came down to the kitchen after he had a shower, he looked at Gustavo and at Chippewa quizzically. Have you been concocting something behind my back? Gustavo laughed. No, we've been talking, not concocting anything, no. Are you hungry? Chippewa asked, scooping 2 eggs and bacon on Dan's plate. Do you want some toasts with that? He poured some coffee in his mug. Come on, sit down and eat. We've got a long day ahead of us, so you'd better fill up that tummy of yours. Dan nodded and went to sit at the table. Gustavo sat beside him and Chippewa took a seat across from him. Dan started eating and then stopped, put his fork down and fixed his gaze at Chippewa. All right, what's going on? What have you been talking about? Okay, Dan, Gustavo began. Don't get all suspicious on us. We've just talked about Daniel and how we could find him, that's all. Yeah, and I gather you've not come up with one good answer, have you? Dan said, grabbing his fork again. I've no idea where he could be. I've racked my brain all night, and all I could think of is when I saw him at the bike race in Big Cypress. Like Damiano suggested, that's a point of departure. He's supposed to find him sometime before he came to the race in real time. Yes, and while he's doing that, we are going to retrace your own steps from when you left college, right? Chippewa asked. Yeah, that's the plan. At least that's what Damianos and I agreed on before we left the forest yesterday. But hang on. I've been thinking about that. Gustavo picked up. Haven't you lived through that period of your life when we were in Key West? Yes, Gustavo, we have, but only partly. I still don't really remember what I did after college, Dan said. Before eating a forkful of eggs, he swallowed. I've got to go back to the apartment and pick up the pieces sort of thing. I must have had a job. And what happened before Fabio left on his holidays I don't remember yet. I know we found out that I was due to take my Navy pilot training in 10 days' time, but there's still pieces missing and I've got to find out what they are. Chippewa had been listening to Dan's little discourse with interest. Inwardly, he was happy that Dan's mind had veered from anger to proactive thoughts. Getting out of bed in the guest room of the Gomez's house, Daniel went to look out the window. He didn't recognize the place, the street, or even anything of the neighborhood. He was only sure of one thing: he was still in Key West. He shook his head and returned to sit on the edge of the bed. He couldn't recall the last time he had visited this place, if ever, with his parents or grandparents. I wonder if I went too far back in time, he asked himself silently. Maybe I should check a calendar. He looked around the room, but there was nothing like that anywhere. Then his eyes rested on the small TV atop the chest of drawers. He went to it, took the remote beside it, and turned the TV on. As soon as he had done so, he heard the anchorman on the morning news talk about a devastating event that had occurred in Western Canada. Daniel immediately wondered if he had been transported to some other place overnight. He returned to watching the program. December 15th, 2006 is a date that will still be remembered by everyone living in Vancouver, BC for years to come. The famous Stanley Park has suffered the loss of nearly 1,000 trees at the last count. Daniel switched the TV off and dropped the remote beside him. He put his head between the palms of his hands and tried to calm his heartbeat. He was definitely lost in his own past. A horrifying thought as far as he was concerned. On December 15th, 2006, where was I? What was I doing? He asked himself. He was only 13 years old then. But why would the manager tell Mr. Gomez that our cruiser was registered at the marina if we weren't there? Maybe Destiny belonged to someone else in 2006. That must be it, he concluded. He lifted his gaze to the ceiling. God, please, he said. I'm in a real fix here. Couldn't you do something about this? He pleaded.